The studies program here at Iowa State University, and we have an exciting panel for you this afternoon. It's on women developing power. Now, originally we had 4 panelists scheduled, and one of them unfortunately couldn't come, and that was Kathy Stout. So maybe next time. The 3 speakers today have all contributed chapters to a new book, Developing Power. How Women Transformed International Development, and the book is available out there on the table for any of you who might like to purchase it. And actually, altogether, 27 women from 12 countries contributed to this book. And they contributed memoir chapters illustrating how their lives changed as they worked to change the world with and for women. Taken together, these memoirs describe how and why this group of activists, practitioners, and academics helped to create a global women's movement. And the 3 women contributors to this book on the panel today are Vaughn Fraser, and Elise Smith, and Cornelia Flora. And they're going to speak about their experiences in development with women. And what I will do is I'll just introduce each one of them, and they will speak. And then at the end we will have questions. We'll leave enough time for you to ask questions. And also we have afterwards at 5 o'clock over in Curtis, there's going to be kind of a place where we can talk informally and with a little bit of food and drink, not alcohol. So you're all welcome to come there as well after the panel. So I'm going to introduce Arvon Fraser first. Arvon Fraser was coordinator of Women in Development Office at the U.S. Agency for International Development from 1977 to 1981. During 1993 to 1994, she was U.S. representative to the UN Commission on the Status of Women with the rank of ambassador. She was also a member of the U.S. delegations to the first 2 UN World Conferences on Women, so that would be 75 and 80, right? And to the UN World Conference on Human Rights in 1993. She is currently Senior Fellow Emerita of the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where from 1981 to 1993 she organized and directed the International Women's Rights Action Watch and co-founded the Institute's Center on Women and Public Policy. During the 1970s, she served as president of Women's Equality Action League and helped found numerous national and Minnesota women's organizations. She is currently a public member of the Minnesota Board of Law Examiners, president of the Friends of the Minneapolis Public Library, and proud grandmother of 7 grandchildren. So welcome.
Thanks very much. You can hear me? The question is, can you see me? What that introduction didn't say, that I think I ought to tell you, is that I was born and raised on a farm about 220 miles northwest of here. And I'm fascinated with this campus because we think at the University of Minnesota we have a big campus, but we drove around this one and it's huge. Anyhow, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to see so many of you here. I thought I would tell a little bit of why and how we wrote this book. How we wrote it is fascinating. We never had a meeting of the authors. We did it all by email, which I think is, well, I assume there are other books recently which have been done by email, but doing a whole book by email I thought was quite fascinating. Why did we put it together? A group of us who had worked together, all of us in this book, touched each other's lives somehow. It's, maybe you will think an incestuous little group of women, not true quite, but we all worked together, and many of us knew each other and became good friends. And after the 4th World Conference on Women in 1995, A few of us were at Martha Lewis's farm over outside of the University of Wisconsin. This has Midwestern roots. You say roots down here too, instead of roots. Anyhow, we met at Martha Lewis's farm and decided this book had to be written. We had all thought that women's history is important. It isn't written very often, and we thought this a very interesting period, and a lot had been accomplished. A lot still needed to be done, but we thought that young people like you ought to know that a group of ordinary citizens in 12 different countries, and we could have had a lot more women writing in this book, can make a difference if they work together. It's kind of I will talk a little bit later about the power of organizations or groups working together. It was very interesting. One thing that's missing from this book is a chapter on sort of health, family planning, etc. And the woman that we wanted to write, a Brazilian, turned us down. And she said she was too busy, etc., etc. Well, after the book came out, she said, you know, I was just scared to write. It fascinated me that a woman, she's quite an executive. She runs an international program. Actually, she runs the Western Hemisphere International Planned Parenthood Federation. But being unwilling or worried about writing still fascinates me. In any event, we got these authors together, and we wanted to make the point that risking what people would call risking, doing the unusual thing, being out in front, actually helped our lives as well as our careers. Too often, people think, oh, you know, play it safe, and that's the way to get ahead. We wanted to point out that not playing it safe was very successful for all of us. Obviously, you know, we weren't perfect the whole time, but we all made our mistakes and we all had setbacks. But basically, we and hundreds, if maybe not thousands of other women helping, changed or put a new segment on the international agenda, that is women, because women in terms of development in countries or local communities or wherever. Let me, and we had a little trouble in the book with our publisher, who wanted us to get a very neat definition of women in development. And we said, well, women are half of society, and development, the other point that we made, and we made it very successfully, both in the women in development movement and ultimately in the human rights movement, because I will show how things evolved. And now I lost my train of thought.
Trying to define women in development.
Trying to define women in development, exactly. Because we are half the population, we were influential and had to deal with many facets of life, not just economic development. That was really the basic point I think we were trying to make, that though women were important in terms of economic development, that all other facets of life were important to that. So let me give you a kind of a rundown of the kinds of women we got and where they were and what they did very quickly. Much of it started, well, we start with the United Nations because at the time in the early 1970s, the United Nations was just taking up the question, because there were many new independent countries, was just taking up the question of development, essentially economic development, though a couple of developing country leaders, President Nyerere of Tanzania, for example, made the argument that development was not just economic development, and that he argued a country could not develop if half of its population, namely women, were left behind. But in any event, it was at the United Nations that much of this got started. Our first chapter is by a woman from Egypt, Aziza Hussein, who I first met at the UN conference, a preparatory meeting in 1974 for the 1975 World Conference, and she taught me how to write a UN resolution. I'd been active in politics. I knew US politics. I knew how to write a resolution in US form, but the United Nations was different. I decided it's different, it's still politics, and she taught me how to, as I say, write the form. Gloria Scott, a Jamaican, educated. I want to make the point that all these women obviously were educated, and I will probably come back to that. Gloria Scott, a Jamaican, educated woman, rose up in the Jamaican government, but was then recruited to work at the UN, and was one of the first to introduce what are called social indicators, health and health and many other topics, into the development mainstream and reports at the United Nations. Leticia Shahani of the Philippines, again, a young woman who went to the United Nations to essentially as a secretary or a clerk, ended up as deputy secretary general, and also a senator in her own country. She was very active with the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which of course was the preparatory body for all these world conferences. And she tells a wonderful story about how she got in trouble with her own government, but essentially saved the day in writing the Women's Human Rights Treaty and drafting it. Margaret Snyder, an American, but who was active in Africa and helped form an African Women's Council. Kristen Timothy, an American who just retired from the United Nations, talks about change within the United Nations and especially getting women into more positions. I will go through this rather quickly and may skip a few because we want to get to the other speakers here. But Daniela Colombo, an Italian, who writes about the movement, the Women in Development movement in Italy. I should say that about the mid-1970s, all of the donor countries, United States, the Scandinavians, Italy, the industrialized countries, all formed women in development units within their development agencies. And we ultimately had a network actually formed by a man in the Paris office of the Office of Economic Development, the Development Assistance Committee. So we got a lot of help from some very influential men. Daniel Colombo, as I said, wrote about what they were doing in Italy. Anne Walker writing, a New Zealander. I always get those two mixed up, and I shouldn't. How after the first World Conference, a group came back to New York, and they got so much mail from women all over the world, they decided, who wanted to know what they could do, how to organize, etc., that they decided they had to organize an International Women's Tribune Center. Ana Maria Portugal of Peru, actually, but working in Chile, writes about ISIS International, which was a network of women started in Rome and Geneva of refugees from developing countries. And they knew that women in countries all over the world were starting women's liberation groups, some of them underground, because as you may or may not know, in many countries you can't start an organization without your government's permission, something we Americans think is incomprehensible. Anyhow, ISIS International was published reports from women's groups all over the world, some of them anonymously, because the women would get into trouble if their names were used. Michaela Waltz, Women's World Banking, a group that started to help women. Some of you are familiar with microcredit organizations. Michaela's idea, she came out of Wall Street but had worked in Beirut office. That's okay. Michaela thought that, rightly, that the financial institutions of the country, of the world, were not dealing with women, and women did not know how to deal with the financial institutions. That Women's World Banking is now a huge organization helping women at both a micro and macro credit level. Devaki Jain of India, writing about the women's movement in India, and was one of the people who helped form DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, that came together in 1985 at the Third World Women's Conference, that really symbolized that this was a truly international movement, and women from developing countries were major players. It's an excellent one. Peggy Antrobus, another Caribbean woman, talking about how women's programs, both in the Caribbean, and then she was very active in DAWN. There's a whole section on in and out of government. I'm in it, and a number of others, that talks about our working in these women in development offices. But the point we really want to make in that section is that it was women in government and women outside government working together. Whatever you're doing, this is, I think, essential to understand that the interaction between what we call the insiders and the outsiders, and meaning insiders in government and those outside, that interaction is essential, especially if you believe in democracy, but even if you don't, and that they need to work together to get something done. Jacqueline Pitangui of Brazil has a wonderful chapter on how they helped write the new Brazilian constitution after Brazilians got rid of their fascist governments in the 70s. She was actually an emigre from Chile, and how they got women's issues into that constitution. Part 4, Influencing Development Policy, takes some of the other areas. Fascinating one on women in forestry by Marilyn Hoskins, an American who proved, I guess, to everybody that women did have an interest in forestry, that women in many developing countries, and even and in Sweden as well, it's an interesting story. A lot of foodstuffs comes out of forests. Dorian Rowan Campbell of Jamaica, again, almost three Jamaicans, who also worked in Canada, but she headed the Women in Development Unit in the British Commonwealth Secretariat in London, and helped women's programs in all the countries that were former British colonies. And she's now growing coffee in Jamaica, organic coffee, back to the farm. Elise Smith, I'll let Elise talk for herself. Very quickly, Martha Lewis, I mentioned her farm, but Martha had a late life career in gardening. She was a very expert gardener, and did a bibliography on food production through gardening, and then began through our office at AID, going to a number of countries and working with women on food production and essentially gardens. She writes a fascinating chapter. What went on beyond the gardening, she got to know the women well enough. Well, there's a wonderful little story about her and gardening. In Jamaica, I think it was, or one of the other Caribbean countries. A few years later, she went back to that country and was staying in a hotel, and on the hotel menu was Mrs. Lewis's some kind of vegetable. Very, very successful. The part for education and development, we'll let Cornelia talk about her chapter. Kathleen Cloud talks about how we intruded ourselves in universities like this that had big, I assume, big aid contracts and did a lot of agricultural and rural development all over the world. Kathleen Cloud and a number of others, and I think Cornelia was probably part of this, we did two things, did a lot of research, but also formed on the campuses sort of women's groups and networks, so that under these big projects, women would go out and try to, well, sometimes not out, sometimes on campus, try to have a women's component or a women's part of these development projects. The final chapter I want to emphasize is Education, Women and Politics in Kenya, written by Etta Gachukia, who is essentially an educator, but equally a woman's activist, had been and was the woman, along with a few others. She'd been appointed member of parliament in Kenya after its independence. And she was one of those responsible for going to the United Nations in 1980, lobbying and getting the World Conference in Kenya in 1985. But she makes the very important point that education, and especially education of girls, is absolutely crucial. Well, how's my time? Is it up? 5 minutes more. Ooh. I want to re-emphasize the education, because we in America take education for granted, and we take education of girls for granted. Worldwide, girls are the majority of the illiterates, and I think education is, and education of girls is probably the #1 priority for the future. Just look at Afghanistan, for example, where when the Taliban took over, they did 3 things. They closed schools for girls, they sent women home, they could not be employed outside the home, and they said you have to totally cover up. In other words, you cannot be seen in public, you cannot participate publicly. Those 3 things, education, employment, and participation in public life, I think, are the 3 essentials for development, and I would add democratic development whether it's Afghanistan, the United States, or any other country. Let me very quickly make 3 points that I think are crucial for understanding how you change public policy, whether it's international, Iowa, or Ames, or US. Number one, I mentioned organizations. People with common interests who want to get something done need to get together and need to have what my historian friend Sarah Evans calls a free space, where you can discuss the issues, analyze the problems, and develop solutions, and how you're going to then make those solutions happen, which goes to law and public policy. Number two, I think that is crucial, which means a respect for law and public policy and those institutions that you deal with it. But we would never have written this book if some of us and women and other women hadn't gotten all the donor countries, as well as the United Nations, some pretty big institutions, countries, and the UN, had not gotten them to focus on women and establish offices for women. The third one comes from that, understanding institutions. To change an institution, you have to understand how it works and what are both the formal and the informal power structures within those organizations. And don't just look at the formal power structure. Every last one of you knows that in some places somebody holds the title and the other person calls the shots. That's the formal and the informal power structure. I think our success of this whole women in development movement, and by our, I mean these thousands of women ultimately worldwide that we're working to include women in the development process, we did understand institutions and how to move them. The last thing I want to say is the evolution of this from women in development, then we went to gender in development, but each of us took off sort of in our own way, and my particular interest, because I had come out of politics and think law and policy is terribly important, was to bring attention to this Women's Human Rights Treaty, which was promulgated or put forth for signature at the 1980 conference, but was getting very little attention because the women were tending to look at programs rather than policy, and I was interested in policy, so took that on as my project, and as was indicated in the introduction, started the International Women's Rights Action Watch after I became an outsider from government, left government. Well, I look forward to your questions and to the other speakers, so thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Arvon. Our next speaker is Elise Smith, and she is a respected leader in the field of gender and international development assistance. She has originated and implemented programs in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the former Soviet Union for over 25 years. In the 1990s, she initiated and is the president of Women's Edge, the Coalition for Women's Economic Development and Global Equality, which advocates for a gender perspective on issues of international aid and trade. She also founded and directed the Global Women's Leadership Program at Winrock International. In the 1980s, she was executive director of the Overseas Education Fund International, and she was one of the first women CEOs among the private voluntary organizations accredited by the United States Agency for International Development, and is a founder of the American Council for Voluntary International Action on Interaction, which has over 160 member associations working in international development and refugee relief. Currently, she serves as a member of the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, which provides guidance to the Administrator of USAID and the State Department of U.S. Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, and many other credits to her to her name. But I'll stop there and let you.
Well, I'm really glad to be here because, in actual fact, I think this is a really crucial time to try to find ways that we can engage as many people as we can, including people right here today at our session, to be active on the international women's issues, because it seems like we have a time when the rhetoric about the important role women have overseas in their countries has been given enormous visibility because of the Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the tsunami even itself. And there's no one who has, I think, not been pelted with the fact that those egregious conditions that existed in those two countries also exist in many forms in many countries around the world. And we had hoped, the optimists in this, that the seeds were there to make the consideration of the important role women play in getting resources to them to move out globally. Well, it hasn't done that, though there's been several things that could move it ahead. And I think one thing we need is real action that's different in this next 5-10 years to complete what started in a space. We have a space now, so how do we use this space for real action that makes a difference? Now, I wanted to, might think I've had a nice straight trajectory in international women's issues and development in my life. I really haven't. I mean, I have to start right there. It is a zigzag story, and I really tell women and men too, that those people who have focused, so it's a nice straight line to see where you want to go, where you want to get a position that has meaning for you, where you can have passion about it. It sometimes happens in a circuitous fashion, and just as a simple illustration, I'll tell you what happened to me, and because it sort of illustrates it, and I'll make it short. I mean, in actual fact, when I was at the university is when I really, in a poli-sci major at the University of Michigan, is when I really got interested in policies and issues globally. But then I had one opportunity to go out of the country to study on a scholarship, and there are more and more scholarships and ways one can do that today than back then. But the big thing that happened, that I married a man, I'm not married to him now, but I'm his friend, that went to Latin America, and I went there for 10 years and had one child that was born in Ecuador. But that period of time, every country that I went into, I found a place to do something separate in the culture. And by doing that, I started to learn what was happening at the poverty level in Latin America, what was happening to women and girls, and some of the egregious problems that existed there. And it wasn't just at the bottom. The women that had education had enormous constraints too, because of the machismo culture, because there were laws that prevented women, even in some countries, from taking their children out to go on a trip without permission of their husband. There was very difficult getting credit. The actual limitations were enormous. And there were groups to work with. And so I had a whole series of different experiences. And they were not all paid, by the way. You know, you don't have to go through life and have money for everything you do. There are places where you can do some things you think are important, and after a bit you'll find it fits into your larger life plan, though you may not know it at the moment. So some of the things that happened, just in brief there, was everything from community development with poverty neighborhoods where Indians from the Sierra would come down to the urban areas to live, bring their children, and have a whole series of problems, and how to help those children and family have a way to adapt and their children to go to school. And working with Peruvian women's groups was one way I learned about how they were working at the community level. And then in educational institutions I was teaching, and there was a whole series. So what happens, you get out of Latin America after 10 years, And then, without knowing what the future held, I was back in the United States in Washington. So the bottom line is, I went to the Overseas Education Fund of the League of Women Voters, and it used to be the Carrie Chapman Catt Fund, just for those who were historians in the group, and we know that she was a very famous Iowan woman leader. But there I volunteered to be on a committee for Latin America, working with women. And I eventually, because I knew the region and I knew the issues, a lot of things started to happen. And in the end, I became the executive director. Now that seems like, it's kind of like not planned. And then after that, the next things followed again on a zigzag way. And each piece added to the whole. So I encourage you to think about, though, the fact that using opportunities that are non-paid is as important as using opportunities that are paid, and getting the cross-cultural experience, even in our own country with immigrant groups, is really important. So moving along, where are we now with the women's issues, international women's issues? 5 years ago, when we set up the coalition Women's Edge, we did that because on the Hill and in the Congress, they always say there's no constituency for international women's issues. They probably know now there is, because Governor and President Bush, rather, makes a point about some of this. But when you look at the legislation and what's really happening with resources getting to women, they're very minimal. The rhetoric doesn't match the reality. So when we formed Women's Edge, which was before there was any organized, multi-sectoral, large women's network with activists around the country, we used to have a loose network in Washington. This network, every time a new administration would come, we get together to make recommendations to the new people that were the appointees. But what happened with that is that it was clear we all were busy in our jobs, right? This is the 80s and then into the early 90s. And then finally, the ultimate part of that was that we really needed a formal organization. After the China Women's Conference, there was a real need to coalesce and bring together many more different kinds of groups to work on international women's issues. And I'll come back to that because I have an action thing that you all might be interested in doing. It's for Iowans, and it's to push Tom Harkin on something, but I'll save it to the end. So what I want to talk about now is why NGO careers are great and what you can do in an NGO. A non-governmental organization is really a place to make change and be transformative and creative. You do it all the time, domestically. I mean, how many of us have worked in any types of organizations to do this? But the ones that work internationally, they may be relief and humanitarian oriented, or they may be a development organization, but in either case, there's two things about them. They're incubators for new ideas, and what happens with a non-governmental group is that in responding to problems to women overseas and working with them, there's a way to help create new synergies and new responses to their needs. And the NGOs, and I'll give you one example, which is before the law and the legal systems became important in development, there was a time when it wasn't so, they weren't even considered a development tool. And we had a small grant at the Overseas Education Fund, probably funded by Arvon, if I remember correctly. And we went to 3 Central American countries to bring women together there to take a look at what were constraints or opportunities under the laws of their countries. This was Central America. One was a Marxist government, Nicaragua. Honduras was a military government. And the third one was a democracy, which is Costa Rica. But in the context of talking about women and the law and the discrimination women had and the machismo problems, the ideologies, the politics just disappeared because every one of the countries had the same problems about discrimination against women and being put down. So out of that, they formed a Central American law network. And what happened is we got our money cut off. Now, why did we get our money cut off somewhere down the line? It was because we were told international development does not consider that the law and legal systems are important to development. Now, you may not believe such a time might have existed, but it did. And so what happened, though, in terms of trying to just catapult this up, is over time, these networks of women in the law, they were called. One developed in Africa, one developed in Asia, and you had the Latin American. It was the beginning of this movement about legal rights for women. And they had legal literacy programs, and the women had techniques that they could review laws that didn't work, that needed to be changed, and this condition of widows was really terrible, and they couldn't own land. I mean, there are all kinds of problems, and today it's a powerful force. How did that happen? Well, it's because an NGO started out, groups of women in the country started to work on these things, and bit by bit evolved a whole movement, and that can happen in many ways, and I think that's important. So what happens on this end? Suppose you're an NGO and you're working in the field in that kind of a program, training programs for women and legal literacy programs or whatever the area would be. Here we have the other side, which is how do we influence the executive branch and the Congress to do some things about some of these issues. And the actual ability to help staff on the Hill write supplemental language or supplemental appropriation possibilities or get ideas about how to formulate the legislation. There's a big opening for those NGOs that are really knowledgeable on the ground and can bring good, concrete, practical solutions to problems. And this advocacy even gets to the point where you, in the U.S., have to advocate for women's programs overseas that are being cast aside. Take the former Soviet Union, when they never had an independent women's movement, and the new women's groups were forming. And what we found out, we formed a group of American NGOs together and went to the government, to the executive branch, and we said, you're not putting any resources into women. And then we discovered that the Government Accounting Office did a report saying that what kind of a strategy for the former Soviet Union do you have for Russia, in particular in Ukraine, where there's not one mention of women, not one. So by pushing the envelope here, eventually that turned around. But it was, all these things they don't happen in an instant. When I say, it did that, it probably took 3 years. And you have to have your friends outside work with you. So the whole point then about NGOs is for any of you who are interested in careers to think about it. It's a very creative space. You can come up with new solutions. You can get more partners from other organizations. And then you have your partnerships with overseas groups. So today, most groups that do development do not do it without partnerships overseas well established. You need that to happen. So I'd like to finish up. Is that about right? Yes? Good. As I thought, I wanted to tell you about Women's Edge just a little bit more, and about the big issue, the elephant in the room that we're not yet dealing with for the women's issues, and that is globalization and trade. What we're doing at Women's Edge is we work on changing and advocating U.S. international economic policies in both international economic policies and human rights in order to support poor women who are working to change their lives and eliminate poverty in them and in their communities, etc. But the two areas we really work on is that we want both foreign assistance and trade to work for women. And right now, if you're following what happens about displaced women overseas from jobs and no other opportunities set up so they learn new skills to earn income, it's multiplying. And the primary people working in all the export processing zones around the world are women laborers, and some conditions are good, some conditions are terrible. The other thing is that if we don't monitor what's happening with these trade agreements, they can certainly get even worse for women. So Women's Edge spent 2 years hiring some, I would call them feminist economists, but what we were trying to do is to get a tool. What kind of a tool? A social impact assessment tool that would allow the United States to be able to forecast before they negotiated a trade agreement what would be the impact on women and girls and men as well in terms of their conditions, and particularly poor women and men. And then they had a chance to find ways to mitigate against that in the language or using development assistance money to make the situation not be as grave. And it's true that there's going to be opportunities for women economically, but we've got to watch what's happening with the trade world because it can undermine even development work. So finally, here's my action challenge for Iowans in the room. How many people are from Iowa originally? You raise your hand? Oh, it's a pretty good contingency there. Well, here's what my offer is, if you like it. The offer is, we have been working on many different things in Women's Edge in terms of initiatives for legislative and with the executive branch. And some of those have been initiatives to, number one, look at the Gains for Women Act, which was a historical effort of 11 sectors. It was like an omnibus bill, historic, to try to get Congress to say these are areas we have to put money into. We did not have that yet succeed. We're working on that continuously. But we have also have in the coming days, we're going to be introducing a Global Economic Opportunity Act for women in developing countries. And we want to get your inputs on it. But right today, what you could do is the tsunami that's occurred earlier really affected women very badly. Poor women lost their simple jobs of netting fish nets, drying fish, marketing, agriculture, and their income is zipped. And they're alone, and they lost their families, many of them. So we have asked Congress to, and Tom Harkin is key on this, he serves on the Appropriation Committee, but it's a $10 million fund for reconstruction assistance to the women, poor women who have suffered from the tsunami and have no immediate way to have any economic opportunity or wherewithal. So what we would propose, we think the vote will come April 6th. And so if you would, you'll find outside kind of a draft of what we're suggesting, is to write a letter, not to Tom Harkin per se, but as though you're writing it to some women who lost their jobs and family there, and saying how you felt, that you know how hard it is, but you think that they can really start again, and that you support this reconstruction fund for them. And what we